We're so excited to have Jeff Fountain. He serves as director of the Schumann Center for European Studies. His area of research, he has a master's in mission leadership and European studies, is something that's just really exciting. I was recently, last week, in Amsterdam, just underneath where Jeff lives with his wife, and I can tell you it is an amazing place. He lives just right at the center of Amsterdam, overlooking just this vibrant urban community, and where he's been for so many decades. He served in Youth of the Mission for 40 years, many of those years as the director of Youth of the Mission for Europe. And so we're just super excited to have him with us and sharing and his heart. And I think too, one of the things is just the fact that in our topic of apologetics, Jeff is someone who has served for so many years in Western Europe, which is of course a very challenging context to make the gospel relevant and communicate. So we're just really excited, and I turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Yes, I'm still a bit huffed that you didn't come on upstairs while I was there.
Next time.
Yeah, really. Yes, I am right here. I'm looking out right now on the railway station, the Central Railway Station, Amsterdam, right on the spot where Amsterdam began, where the Amstel River flowed out into the waters that went into the Zuiderzee. And this is where 750 years ago, Amsterdam began as a small fishing village. And I'm looking out on a bridge here that at least one writer says this is where world capitalism began, because the first stocks and shares were traded here on this bridge and in this area where the herring fleets came in, and the Dutch had figured out how to create stocks and shares so that everybody could part own a boat and a company, and according to the size of the catch, you know, these shares were being bought and sold, and then they went around to the church behind us here to write it all down on paper, and eventually in about 1602, I think it was, they set up the world's first stock exchange, which is still just a few hundred meters away from where I am right now. So this, as a historian living in the center of an open air museum called Amsterdam, it's a very invigorating place to be. My wife and I have only been living here for 4 years. Before that, we lived in the Dutch countryside for well over 40 years. But we've had no regrets making this move right into the center of the city here, because, well, it's actually very great to be close to the railway station to get to Schiphol, for example. So I'm going to talk on theology in the public square, because this is a personal passion. I wouldn't have always put it this way, but I realized that ever since my faith crisis period at university, when I was trying to match my studies with my faith and found very few people who could help me, I've been seeking to try to understand how to make sense of the world, how to make sense of history particularly, and how to connect my own personal spiritual life with all the activities going on in our world. So I'm calling this Theology for Life. Now, when my we have 3 sons, and when my youngest son introduced his future wife to my mother by, yeah, I guess it was Skype in those days, my mother asked her name is Rose, well, dear, she said, what are you studying? And Rose just said, theology. Oh, how boring, my mother said. Well, yeah, my mother was a very keen believer, and she wouldn't have understood it that way, but she had a lot of theology, but it was unexamined. But nevertheless, her impression of theology was that it involved dry, academic, boring, lifeless study. And many of us do have an unconscious and an unexamined theology. To be honest, the mission I'm part of, Youth for the Mission, doesn't like to talk about theology, doesn't like to talk about philosophy. And I find that personally dangerous because it means that we have an unexamined theology and unexamined philosophy, because you cannot avoid those areas. It perhaps comes from the Pentecostal roots of this movement that then became more evangelical and became more ecumenical and embracing Catholics and so forth. But our roots are still showing, which was tended to be anti-intellectual and anti-formal theology. And what I've realized that this can be rather dangerous, because we need to be able to examine these areas of understanding. And what we need to understand is that our belief about God, our thoughts about God, are the starting point for all of our thinking. This shapes everything else. And we may have grown up in a church that kind of had a, spiritual schizophrenia. We thought, well, God was relevant for Sundays and relevant for your personal life and so forth. But Monday to Saturday, you really, what did God have to do with mathematics or chemistry or learning a language, et cetera? We never connected the dots in my traditional Baptist church. Actually, I'm still a member of the Baptist church I was baptized in and grew up in. I'm a missionary member of that church. But to be honest, my church didn't give me the support I needed when I went through this faith crisis at university. It didn't help me really connect my understanding about God to every area of life. And this is where the topic that Joseph was talking about comes in, and I was wondering if he was going to actually go in the direction that I wanted to go with this understanding of imago Dei. You see, our understanding of God will shape our understanding of ourselves. If we don't believe in a God, we think we are just chemical accidents, nothing but slime plus time. And there are all sorts of deep ramifications that come from that. Now, we're sheltered from a lot of the consequences of assuming that there is no God, simply because if we live in Europe, we're living in a part of the world that's been shaped, some parts of it for 2,000 years, other parts for less than 1,000 years, but by Christian thinking. Just think of the American founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Now, I have an Indian friend who says, wait a minute, come to India. Nobody believes that. The Brahmin come from the head of God. The untouchables come from the foot of God. Nobody believes that all men are equal. Now, let's ignore the fact that they're using, the sexist language that, of course, has only recently changed, talking about men. Let's ignore the fact that some of these founding fathers of America were actually slave owners and talking about all men being equal. Where did they get this idea from, that this was self-evident? And that was a mistake of the Enlightenment. They thought, these Enlightenment values and human rights and so on just drop out of the sky suddenly in the 17th and 18th century. No, they were the products of centuries and centuries of Christian impact in the cultures all across Europe, from Armenia to Iceland. And that's what the settlers that came from Europe to America, they brought with them. And so if they truly, well, of course, they gave nominal credence to a God as well, but he was rather deist God, which was the first step towards, or that was one of the major steps towards the secular position we find ourselves in now. But you see, there's an English philosopher named John Gray who wrote a book called Straw Dogs, in which he said, and he's an agnostic, he's not a believer, but he said this: humanists are nothing but Christians in disguise, because the way they understand, human beings. But where did they get these positive ideas about human beings from? If we are nothing but slime plus time, then actually there's no basis whatsoever for talking about the dignity and the sanctity of human life. And there's no basis whatsoever, really, for talking about human rights, because that's where it all comes from. And so our understanding about God affects our understanding about who we are, and therefore also our understanding about society, how humans should relate together. Before the concept of agape love came along, and that was a word that actually, when the Septuagint was translated, they had to create a Greek word for this concept of a self-giving love, this loving kindness. And they created the word agape. And before this concept really took root, there were two main ways of human association. One was on blood ties, tribes, clans, and eventually you get the concept of nation, which comes from the word to nativity, or to be born. The other was power, strong men who would, like local warlords, etc., etc. So those are the two ways in which human beings congregated, lived together, associated together, and created society. But the coming of agape brought a whole new possibility that people could actually live together in covenant with each other under God. And this is how the first monasteries, of course, were established, as covenants under God. And I have a professor friend from the Free University here in Amsterdam, Govert Bouws, who has developed this whole understanding very much, how much agape love has been shaping the development of European civilization. And he says that the monasteries became the models for the first city-states in northern Italy and then later in the Low Countries. And they were even created around covenant that would be renewed annually. So that when you come to the time of the Reformation, Erasmus says, what is a city but one big monastery? And you actually see that here in Amsterdam. You see if you go to any European city that's older than 500 years, you'll find that before the Reformation, a large part of the city, maybe a third, maybe even up to a half, was actually monasteries. It played a huge role in the lifestyle of the cities, but the concept of covenant was well understood. It was also transformed to the guilds, the trade guilds as well. They were also based on covenant. And so our understanding of society, how people should relate together, is hugely influenced by our understanding of who God is. Now, there's a lot of grace in European society simply because we still live on a fading memory of Christian truth, even if we're unaware of it, as John Gray might say. It'll affect our understanding of the environment and of creation and our responsibility towards it. It'll affect our understanding of the meaning of life, of international relationships. How should nations relate together? Now, we're facing a huge crisis in Europe right now with the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And people are appalled by this. And we're realizing that some of the institutions that were set up after the Second World War to try to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again, has somehow failed in their goals. There's some vulnerabilities there. What is generally not realized is those institutions, I'm talking about the UN, I'm talking about the Council of Europe, I'm talking about the European Union, or the Court of Justice and so forth. 70 years ago, we can see that networks of Christians were extremely influential in creating these institutions to say never again. Even the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights was a Christian initiative. I've done some research on this, and without the initiative coming from Christians, that would never have happened. There was just a moment, a window of opportunity, actually, after the war and before the Cold War really started, where there was enough consensus around the world, where Africa, influenced by the missionaries, before China went communist, and so on, where they could get this huge majority within the UN for voting through the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with only 3 abstentions: Russia, Cuba, or I should say Soviet Union and Cuba, and South Africa, for obvious reasons. So we take for granted the Christian roots of these institutions, or let's say the Christian influence that shaped these institutions. Of course, they reached out to people like Gandhi and others to get them on board, but the initiative came from those people who had an understanding of God as a good creator, loving, forgiving God who has created every one of us in his own image. So this affects international relations as well. How should nations relate together? Now, we're actually touching on a subject here that I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I'll just say it, that we as evangelicals tend to have a blind spot in. We don't really go there much. We don't think about these things very much. And this is a great weakness in our tradition, and it needs to change. In the area of business and economics, again, you know, people would sit in church and be wonderful Christians on Sunday. But what did that have to do with economics? I have a friend who was the economic advisor to President Václav Havel in the Czech Republic when he was only 27. His name is Thomas Sedlacek. And he's written a book called The Economics of Good and Evil, in which he goes through history. He goes through the Old Testament, the New Testament, and he shows that economics is really all about making good choices for the good. But how do you define good if you take God out of the picture? But he'd say so much of our economic thinking has been shaped by faith issues. Take the words credit and debit. Well, you know, with the double column accounting system, which was invented by a monk who wanted to bring order out of the chaos of his finances. And this is part of the image of God in us, is that we too are to bring order out of the chaos around us, as God the Creator did in the beginning and has continued to do. We are to reflect his image by also bringing order out of chaos. And so he developed this double column bookkeeping system that's used all around the world. And it has 2 names on it, credit and debit. And of course, credit comes from the word credo, to believe. Debit or debt in several languages, European languages, is the word for a financial debt, for example, or guilt or sin. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those, as we forgive our debtors. So Jesus told actually many stories about economics. And we must learn to recover these areas that we've allowed through the schizophrenia to be just, oh, that's the worldly system, we don't go there. The same with politics. Many people have the idea that politics is a dirty business, so there's no place for Christians to be in. Now, if that's true, then that's a very good reason why Christians should be there. This has been a very deeply rooted concept in Eastern and Central Europe amongst evangelicals. Well, we don't get involved in politics because it's so worldly. Well, John 3:16 said God so loved the world, and his intention for the world is to be redeemed. You see, so if we take God out of the picture, even if we're good believers, but we take God out of the picture from Monday to Saturday, it has very huge consequences. And I don't need to tell you really the consequences it would have for marriage and for family. And our understanding of marriage is actually in some way reflecting something of the Trinitarian interdependency in the Godhead. And our marriages are to actually to be a sign of the coming marriage feast of the Lamb. In the area of education, what do we base our education on once we take God out of the picture? And we see the development of education has been again and again by people who took the Bible as their guide, starting with the Jews, or even earlier than that, the Israelites and the Hebrews, because they got the message in Deuteronomy 6:6 to teach your children. And so the Israelites were the first fully literate society, but going right through history, we come up to the role of the monasteries in education. We can talk about people like Jan Amos Comenius, the Moravian bishop, who actually died just a few hundred meters from where I am now. I spent the last 10 years of his life here in Amsterdam. And he's known as the father of modern education, created the world's first picture book for children, for example. But he drew his framework for teaching the children was to look at God's book of works, his creation, as well as God's book of words, the Bible. Or we could look at the Sunday school movement in England. That was the first step to free education for all. We could look at the universities, where theology was the queen of the sciences, where even today the University of Oxford has as its motto, the Lord is my light. And so even when we look at our bodies, when we take God out of the picture, we start to do all sorts of strange things in our minds about our bodies. And so we're afflicted right now with this Gnostic heresy that the body is secondary to the world of thought, and so therefore what goes on in our mind is far more important than the physical reality. And today there are laws against people who are saying you can change your understanding of your sexuality in your mind, but people are going through very expensive physical operations for drastic sex changes because we can change the physical, but don't allow people to be counseled that concerning how they're understanding their own sexuality. And this is just a Gnostic heresy that denigrates the body over and against the theoretical or the mental, or we would say spiritual as well. So our understanding of who God is and how he relates to his creation affects everything. And that's why theology is so important. Now, the problem is, in our evangelical tradition, we're not very good at translating who God is into the issues around us. There are three main streams that have affected the church in the thinking of theology for everyday life. The first one we call the Catholic social thinking at the end of the 19th century, and Pope Leo XIII first pronounced this, and it started with the Imago Dei, human beings created in the image of God, and how that everything flows from this, the dignity of life, the sanctity of life, the human rights, but also the concept of solidarity. If God is reflected in the life of every human being, and that's hard sometimes to actually cope with when you're thinking of the bestiality that's being revealed by the Russian invasion right now. But if every human being is created in the image of God, then that means we should have a strong sense of solidarity with the whole human race. Now, I know as evangelicals, we object when people say we're all children of God, but that's the truth. That sounds very liberal to many people, but that's actually the truth. That doesn't say we're all born again, or we're all regenerate, or we're all back in relationship with our Creator. But there is a sense in which, yes, we are all children of God. And what I'm realizing this, especially right now with this current Ukrainian war going on, we cannot understand really what's happening there without understanding the great split, the great schism that was on Joseph's chart earlier in the 11th century there. And so there was this reaction between the Protestants and the Orthodox, and you defined yourself by we are not them. And then the same thing happened with the Protestants at the time of the Reformation. We are not them. I mean, what a silly word, Protestant. Have you ever thought about that? What a stupid word. Why do we allow ourselves still to be called Protestants? What are we protesting against? We are for, But anyway, this is how we've demonized the opposite. The Catholics were from the whore of Babylon, etc., etc. And then all sorts of free churches came out of the mainstream denominational territorial churches in Western Europe, say, let's say the Church of England, or we say the Dutch Reformed Church, or the Lutheran Church, etc. Then dissidents came out of those, and so we are reacting again and again and again and again. We are not them. We are not them. We are not them. And we become smaller and smaller in our thinking, and we've lost this sense of solidarity, not only with the whole human race, but also, you know, with all of God's people. And this is something that's a real weak point in our evangelical thinking. In fact, there's a Catholic historian, lived 2 generations ago, Christopher Dawson. He said this: Catholics see woods, Protestants see trees. And he meant by this that at the time of the Reformation, the territorial national churches emerged, and their focus was on the nation, Church of England, Dutch Reformed Church, etc. Whereas the Catholic Church saw itself as a world church. So they were seeing the trees. The denominational or the territorial churches are seeing the woods. But then we go further and we see all the evangelical free churches emerging for good theological reasons, maybe, but still, that's our world. We see branches. Our world is a local church. The Protestants' world was their nation. The Catholics' world was the world. And you can see how this has shrunken our horizons, shrunken our understanding about the church, and really, actually, about God. And so Catholics embrace the solidarity of the whole human race, not them and us, not based on nationalism. And this is something, again, we're facing right now in Russia. This awful alliance between Russian nationalism and Russian orthodoxy that is creating a crisis all around the Orthodox world. And Orthodox theologians have had to create a declaration saying this is a heresy. This Ruski Mir, Russian world, is a heresy, and we need to pray for repentance, and we need to pray that there be a change. This has given Vladimir Putin a carte blanche to do what he's doing right now. And so because he's not seeing a big enough picture. My country first, whenever you start to hear that, and let's face it, unfortunately, we've seen, you know, the Orthodox are horrified by what's happening with their Orthodox brothers and sisters in Russia. But we in Europe have been horrified to see what's been happening amongst our evangelical brothers and sisters in America, getting right behind somebody who says, my country first. And this kind of nationalism allied to a pseudo faith. So not only did the Catholics then embrace this solidarity and embrace human rights stemming from the fact that every human being was created in the image of God, they embraced something called the common good. That is, we therefore need to prioritize the search for the common good of all, the common good in society. Now, I don't know if you've heard something about the Seven Mountain idea that's been very popular amongst evangelical supporters of Donald Trump. And it's being said, well, yes, this idea came from Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright. Well, there's a little grain of truth there, but my honest opinion is that that's become a monster, because it is saying we need to get Christians in a position, at top positions of all of these different spheres of life, and then we can Christianize our nation again. And this is not God's way. This is not God's way. This is a distortion of justice. It is, God intends justice for all, not just justice for people who call themselves Christians. And the role of government, what government is for, is to create justice for all, not justice for a small group. And so we've got to find a way in our pluralistic societies of encouraging justice for all. And we as Christians should be fighting for justice for all, not just justice for our own group. And the awful polarization that happens when you go in trying to get justice for your own group, it's got nothing to do with the gospel at all. And so seeking for the common good of all that also is somewhat related to the concept of common grace, which was not taught a lot in my circles. And common grace is the understanding that God is busy in the world, even outside of the church. That, unregenerate people can do good things, and regenerate people can do really bad things. So that's why the Bible says again and again, God sends the sun and the rain on the good and the bad. And this understanding is that God is out there in society, and our task is to go and join him in the neighborhood. That's the title of a book by Alan Roxburgh. And we can extend it saying, joining God in the public square. Sometimes I talk about joining God in Brussels. Let's see what God is doing within the Brussels circle and the EU and so on. And so the Catholics developed this teaching called personalism. Not capitalism, not socialism, but the person should be at the center of our vision for society. And this comes from our understanding of who God is. This was the basis for the Christian democratic movement, by the way, and for people like Robert Schuman and Konrad Adenauer, who really were the spiritual fathers of what eventually became the European Union. Now, secondly, I talked about the Christian social thinking, Catholic social thinking. A second mainstream has been Calvinism, as developed by people like Abraham Kuyper, who was the prime minister of this country in Holland in 1905, for example, 1901 to 1905. In fact, he used to walk right in front of this building from his home, which is in the same street, over to his newspaper office or to the building of the Free University. He founded the Free University in Amsterdam. He founded a newspaper called The Standard. For 50 years, he was the editor of that, even while he was prime minister. One of his rival editors called him the man with 10 heads and 100 arms. He was so prolific in what he wrote. And he developed an understanding of Calvinism to fit every sphere of life. Now, I could take you on a walk from here 500 meters down to the new church right on the Dam by the palace here. And in 1880, when Kuyper opened up launched the Free University here in Amsterdam, he made his famous speech that some of you would be familiar with, where he said, there's not one square inch of human life where Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not say mine. Now, when I first came across that quote, that began to transform my understanding. This is what I was looking for. And later on, I heard Lauren Cunningham beginning to say similar things, it was, for him, it was a whole revelation because he had a Pentecostal background. But actually, this country of the Netherlands had been shaped by that kind of thinking and had come to a place of actually rejecting it because of certain extremes. So this understanding that came from Calvin and Kuyper, and it was Francis Schaeffer who first began to introduce me to this reformed Christian thinking and really helped me in my crisis at university. The understanding that all spheres of life were to come under the lordship of Christ. And this is exactly what Paul says in Ephesians and Galatians and Colossians and so on. All things under heaven and on earth are going to be reconciled together in Christ. And so this needs to be our view of why we're here, what our task is to be in the public square. My dad called it the other 100 hours. He was a businessman who was very much involved in the beginning of the charismatic movement. He was an elder in the Baptist church. And one day he went to the pastor and he said, oh, I'm really having problems in my business. Would you help me? Don't ask me about your business. The pastor said, I only studied theology. And my dad thought, well, what good is theology if it doesn't help you live Monday to Friday or Saturday? And he said, you have 168 hours in the week, and maybe you're involved in church activities for 12 hours of the week, and you sleep 56 hours of the week. That leaves you 100 hours left over where you're not at church and you're not sleeping. Now, sometimes, those activities overlap, I realize. But those 100 hours, he said, the other 100 hours, what does the gospel have to do with that? And really, as evangelicals, we've not been very good at answering that question. You see, John Stott came out with his book, let me see, Issues Facing Christians Today. I think it was 1984 or so. And it was a radical book for evangelicals. And he talked there about the half a century where we have we've missed the boat as evangelicals. We're so busy defending the gospel of salvation against the liberals that we forgot the gospel of the kingdom. We're so focused on the gospel only of salvation, we had no place for, we didn't realize the gospel of the kingdom, God's rule in every sphere of life, seeing his shalom in every sphere of life was really the task of the body of Christ. And the people like Wesley or William Carey believed this as well. They were holistic people. When you read about William Carey and what he did in India, it was 7 years before they first saw their convert, but he started the Indian Horticultural Society. He introduced, he started some of the first newspapers there. He opened up the first libraries there and the savings banks there, and he did all sorts of other social projects. He understood that his task as a missionary was to encourage God's kingdom to come in all spheres of life. And this is what we pray when we pray the Lord's Prayer. May your kingdom come. In other words, may your will be done in Europe, in India, in Ukraine, as it is in heaven. It's not just, you know, when kingdom come, we think, well, that's when Jesus comes back. No, we're to pray for the increase of his will to be done. So that's the second stream. A third stream is Leslie Newbigin. Many of you know his name and how he based his thinking a lot on the Hungarian philosopher Polanyi. And he talked about the gospel as public truth. It's not just private. It's not just about church and personal discipleship and saving souls, church growth, but it had to do with proclaiming good news for all of life, all of society, all of creation. Shalom is God's intention for all of his creation. But this has not been reflected in our theological education. I recently did some research on evangelical attitudes towards European integration. I interviewed 20 evangelical leaders, church leaders, movement leaders, academics and specialists. How, in their understanding, what was evangelical attitudes towards the whole European integration project, or the EU, if you like. And the horrifying thing, we found different categories, but almost unanimously, the people I interviewed said the dominant evangelical attitude is ignorance and indifference. There were some who felt, oh, this is the beast, this is Babylon, we mustn't, you know, we must do everything we can to resist it. There were others who said, well, you know, God's preferences for the nation state, so therefore we should safeguard the sovereignty of nation states and so forth. But basically, people didn't really know how to think about the question. They'd say, there's a Dutch expression, that's too far from my bed. I think you can understand what that means. You know, okay, we don't go there, it's too far from my bed. I like to ask them, oh, did you buy your bed at IKEA? Which would be very European, of course. So basically, we haven't been stimulated to think about this because we look at the branches instead of the whole woods. And so when I was first became director of Youth with a Mission in Europe, I took my leadership team down to Brussels. This was 1991. We went down there to discover, now, what is this European community all about? What should we think about it? This is before it became the European Union. And an official met us in a basement of the European Commission building, Berlaymont, shook our hands and said, shall we begin with prayer? Wow, that was the last thing we expected to hear. Prayer in the European Commission building. Then he began to tell the story of the Christian forgiveness and reconciliation that was right at the root of how this whole movement began. And the fact that Robert Schumann, who was a very godly man of prayer, a very saintly guy. In fact, the Catholics are trying to beatify him now, but I must admit, actually, I have not found anything negative about that man and all that I've read about him, and I've written a book about him as well. That this was motivated by this Catholic social thinking, and they were thinking about how should we relate together as nations, as neighbors, if we are to love our neighbor, Jesus said, and he gave us, if we are to love our neighbor, what does that mean for the French concerning the Germans? And actually, that's a huge question right now for Ukrainians. In the last 3 or 4 years, I've been to Ukraine several times for meetings with church leaders and politicians, and they wanted to talk about this question. Now, right now, it's very difficult for them to think about forgiveness and reconciliation. And probably until Putin is out of the way, it won't be possible any more than it would have been if Hitler had not been out of the way. But these men were thinking about the kind of Europe that would please God. Now, some time ago, while I was doing this research, I came across this book called African Public Theology. Let me see. I can't get this in focus. That's funny. This is this automatic program. It's called African Public Theology, and it asks the question, what kind of Africa does God want? We need to be asking this question, what kind of Europe does God want? What does that look like? You see, Europe right now is in a huge crisis. Post-Brexit, post-COVID, is post-COP26, we've got this invasion going on right now, and the elections in Hungary and Paris. What's going to happen on Sunday in France is going to have huge repercussions for all of us in Europe. And we need to be praying that it will not go the wrong way to have a Putin stooge there in France. These are big issues. And what are we doing as evangelicals to actually shape the future of Europe? And that's when I realized, when I was hearing this story down there in Brussels in 1991, I said, would you help us to have a consultation with evangelical leaders? Because we need to hear the story. We need to repent from all these conspiracy ideas that have held us back and given us a fatalistic approach to the future and paralyzed us from being effective salt and light. And so that's led to a whole series of conferences. And in fact, since 2011, we've been holding the State of Europe Forum in the capital of the country with the presidency of the EU. And we haven't been able to hold it the last couple of years with COVID. But in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be holding it in Paris. It'll just be before May the 9th, which is, you probably know that's the day when there's going to be a big parade, a victory parade in Red Square. But May the 9th is also the day, 1950, when Robert Schuman gave a speech which presented a plan that started the whole ball rolling. It was a speech only 3 minutes long, shorter than you and I can make a cup of coffee or boil an egg. And yet in those 3 minutes, Robert Schuman was able to lay the foundation for the European house in which today 500 million Europeans from 27 different nations have been living together in peace. So that's remarkable. And so we're going to be asking ourselves, what is the contribution that evangelicals should be making to the future of Europe? We need to be understanding the times, looking at the state of Europe today, and looking forward to ask now, what then? What should God's people, Israel, as it were, how should what should we be doing for the future? And there'd be very few places where these kind of questions are being put on the table. And so that's why we hold this event. It's an initiative of the Schuman Center for European Studies, an evangelical initiative, but we've embraced people from Orthodoxy right through to Pentecostalism. Everybody is welcome from all sorts of disciplines to wrestle with the issues that are facing us in Europe today. But part of my research that I did then was also to research what's being taught in our theological seminaries. I looked at the curriculum of 69 evangelical institutions related to the European Council of Theological Education. I could only find one course that was looking at European studies, and that really was talking about faith or theology in the public square. Now, I may have missed some because you don't always know what the titles of these courses represent. But this is a very sad state of affair. We have a major blind spot as evangelicals. All our theology is being focused into the church, focused into personal faith, and not Monday to Saturday in society. We're not joining God in the public square like we ought to. And So we need to ask ourselves, what kind of Europe do we want? What kind of Europe does God want? That's why we've been developing a master's program in missional leadership and European studies that we do with 4 Mission College. It's recognized by Newman University in Birmingham, in England. But it's a part-time master's course that people come here to Amsterdam 3 times a year for. So this is, yeah, forgive me if I'm a little bit passionate about this, but this is my, this is a life quest. What does the gospel of the kingdom, not just the gospel of salvation, but the gospel of the kingdom, have to do with all of life? And it becomes a surprise when we first realize that Jesus actually hardly said anything about the church, but again and again and again, he hammered on about the kingdom. Now, if this was the most important theme for him, it ought to be for us as well. We've got a lot of homework to do. Let me finish there.